folks, Crystal and Jim, for making this event hybrid. And to everyone else, welcome. Thank you for being here. If you don't know me, I'm Kano. I'm the Events and Activities Specialist at Seattle Central Student Leadership. And as your MC for this event, on behalf of the Day of Remembrance Planning Committee, I heartily thank you for joining us today. 聞いてくださって誠にありがとうございます。And we are especially grateful to the community members whose family members were incarcerated and who are still here fighting to make sure incarceration is remembered. They are the ones who we gather here to honor, and we will be intentional about recognizing how incarceration impacted their families, as well as recognizing their resilience. So, without further ado, let's have our land acknowledgement and labor acknowledgement from Christine Ma.
I'm Christine Law. I'm the specialist for the Anesthesia program here at Central. It's a support program for Asian and Pacific Islander students, and I'm here to give the land and labor acknowledgement. On behalf of the Seattle colleges, we acknowledge that we occupy the traditional ancestral lands of the Coast Salish peoples, specifically Duwamish tribe, a people who are still here, and that we continue to honor and bring to light their ancient heritage. Without them, we would not have access to this gathering, dialogue, and learning space. We ask that we take this opportunity to thank the original caretakers of this land who are still here. Today, in this present moment, we honor the survival, the adaptations, the forced assimilation, and the resilience and creativity of Native peoples, past, present, and future. We encourage participants to consider their responsibilities to the people and land, both here and elsewhere, and to stand in solidarity with Native, Indigenous, and First Nation peoples and their sovereignty, cultural heritage, and lives. We also pause to recognize and acknowledge the labor upon which our country, state, and institutions are built. We remember that our country is built on the labor of enslaved people who were kidnapped and brought to the US from the African continent, and we recognize the continued contribution of their survivors. We also acknowledge all immigrant labor, including voluntary, involuntary, trafficked, forced, and undocumented peoples who contributed to the building of this country and continue to serve within our labor force. We acknowledge all unpaid caregiving labor. To the people who contributed this immeasurable work and their descendants, we acknowledge their indelible mark on the space in which we gather today. It is our collective responsibility to critically interrogate these histories, to repair harm, and to honor, protect, and sustain this land.
Thank you so much, Christine. And following that, let's take a moment to think about the space that we're in. This is Broadway Performance Hall. Is the last remaining part of the original Broadway High School building. It's the first high school in Seattle. 216 Japanese American students were removed from these buildings here and incarcerated at Puyallup after Executive Order 9066. Broadway High School then closed in 1946 due to low enrollment. What do you think happens when you incarcerate half your student body? And housed a series of technical and vocational schools before becoming Seattle Central College. So these buildings we're in right now carry the history of incarceration. These are things that happen here to students that walk through these halls, attend class here. And we will keep that in mind as Paul Krause takes us to some background about those who helped us, the book that we will be listening to our lovely author and illustrator speak about today. Sorry, the slides are out of order.
Thank you very much. My dad attended Broadway High School. He had graduated already when he was taken with the other Japanese Americans who attended here, and 120,000 Japanese Americans on the West Coast, to be incarcerated in the interior, desolate areas of the United States, strictly because of their nation of their parents' ancestry or their ancestry. Means a lot to me to be doing this here, and means a lot to me just to be a part of the Day of Remembrance program itself, but to do that here at Broadway High School means some additional meaning to it. I like that song. I always think when I grow up, I'm gonna be just like Yuri Kuchiyama. So I'm still waiting for that day. Someday. Maybe not just like, but even if we could come any place close to who she was, we could be proud. I was honored on behalf of my family in August of 2017. And I was contacted by Cassie Chin, the Wingwood Museum Executive Director, about taking part in this project. But more than an honor for my family to be included in this project, it was something that I was extremely grateful for, because it gave me a chance on behalf of my family to thank these individuals, these community members who had done so much for my family. And I've learned over the years they've done so much for my family. One of the reasons I was contacted by the Wingwood Museum is people knew my mom was a Quaker, who the Quaker Church, Lloyd Schmo, one of the posters here with him. Something else he did post-war to help atomic bomb victims in Hiroshima. But prior to the war, when there was all the anti-Japanese American hatred being spread throughout the community, Lloyd Schmo was one of the people who went around and helped clean up graffiti off of people's garages, storefronts, and organized people to do that, to stand with us, to help us. Another person on my dad's side who's mentioned in the book is Reverend Emery Andrews, who growing up, he would come over to our house to see how our family was doing. And so my dad only went to church on Easter and Christmas. So, you know, if he was coming there, he was getting around, and he did get around. In fact, he got all the way around to going to see his people, his congregation. He got all the way around to Minidoka, Idaho, to go see them after they had been taken away. So it was really quite an honor, and again, a gift for me to be able to say thanks in a way by being part of the discussions, sharing stories about people who had helped our community. 3 Nisei who were involved, second generation Japanese Americans, same generation as my parents, were Louise Kashino, Yoshi Nakagawa, and Mei Sasaki. Louise and Yosh both passed away. I think, did they get to see the book published? No. I think they both passed away as the book was in the works. So the book is dedicated to them. And others involved were Meredith Higashi, Debbie Kashino, David Nomura, and David Yamashita. Today, it's an honor to introduce Sansei brother of mine, way back in Seattle, Sansei Ken Mochizuki. He's the author of the book, Those Who Helped Us. Ken had been a longtime staff journalist with the publications International Examiner and North American Post, located in Seattle's Chinatown International District. His career as a published author began with the release of the children's picture book, Baseball Saved Us, in 1993. Since then, he is the author of 7 books in the young readers genre, including his latest, the graphic novel, Those Who Helped Us. He is also the author of numerous adult histories, mostly about Japanese and Asian Pacific Americans. Kiku Hughes, illustrator for the book, is a Yonsei cartoonist, Yonsei being the next generation after us, based in the Seattle area. Her first graphic novel, Displacement, was published by First Second in 2020. Her work, published by Nickelodeon, Dark Horse, Short Box, Beyond Anthologies, and more, explores themes of identity, queer romance, soft sci-fi, and anti-capitalist futures. So join me in welcoming Ken and Kiku.
I was asked to explain a little bit about what Day of Remembrance is. It commemorates February 19th, 1942, when President Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. Now, what this executive order did was authorize the U.S. military, specifically the U.S. Army, to exclude certain people who they decided on or designated from certain areas of the country that have been on the U.S. West Coast on the spot. But nowhere in the executive order did it mention Japanese, but everybody knew who it was meant for. Now, how were they able to do this when 70% of those of Japanese descent on the West Coast were U.S. citizens? They were children, the namesake, like I'll explain, born here in the United States. The Roosevelt administration circumvented the U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights by making this a military matter rather than a legal matter. And the U.S. Supreme Court upheld the order on that basis. It was a military issue, not a legal one, until the Supreme Court reversed itself in late 1944. So that's what this is about. So we're going to get to a video that, or animated video that the Seattle channel produced during a segment of this book.
By late October, it started getting cold. This wasn't Seattle cold. This was desert cold. Those lucky enough to have a pot-bellied stove in their place scrambled for the coal. More family members meant more hands and more coal. Then school started again, or what could be called school. No desks, no blackboard, no books. Just a pot-bellied stove in the corner. Little heat. And in November, the rains came. All of that dust turned into a sea of mud. And ended up inside. The Protestants at Minnedoka had their services together, calling themselves the Federated Christian Churches. Reverend Andy was there for the Christmas service. He had moved his family to Twin Falls to be near us. Deaconess Margaret Peppers from St. Peter's Episcopal Parish back in Seattle also lived somewhere close by. When Reverend Andy lived in Twin Falls, we didn't know what happened to him back then. Reverend Andy went to a cafe in Twin Falls. He waited and waited for service. And the cafe's owner came and threw Reverend into the house. The same cafe owner stood outside the Andrews rented house,
Traitor,
shouting,
turncoat, Jap lover.
Then the same man buys the house, forcing the Andrews to move across the street. Flat tires started happening on the blue box. All of this because some of the locals knew he was our minister. I should have felt guilty about giving any kind of Christmas present from Christian churches outside of the camp. When good people like Reverend Andy just got misery. New Year, same thing every day. It got really cold, below zero. The mud froze overnight and then back to mud during the day. Can't play basketball yet, so I practiced jumping. Yuri became a teacher's assistant at the camp's Huntsville Elementary. Then she became a teacher when the real teacher left.
I'm at my wit's end trying to teach, because I don't know how. Should I have him march in and out like Miss Mahon did? I wish I was Miss Mahon.
I am Murakami as the teacher at Stafford Elementary, right?
That's right. And Masa's her assistant, right?
They never were teachers before.
You're right. They weren't. Want to take a walk to the other side of camp?
Hi.
Hi, Masa.
Yoriko, Sumiko Tanaka? My, haven't seen you girls since Seattle. What block are you at?
19.
We hear you teach a fourth grade class here. You weren't teachers before, right?
Just taught some Sunday school.
I was an assistant for second grade at Huntville and the teacher left, so I'm stuck with the class and they're totally out of control. How do you do it?
We get them food or some kind of treats.
But it's all part of a lesson. Fruits of the labor, that you work hard first, then get something in return.
Where do you get the treats and how can you afford it?
We go into town, Twin Falls. Sure, it costs, but it's worth it.
There's two of them, so maybe they can afford it. I can't. I need to get to a college. But what chance of that now?
Yuri told Mr. Kleinhoff that she had quit. But then maybe there still were miracles, even for us.
I'm Tom Bodine with the American Friends Service Committee, commonly known as the Quakers. We are members of the National Japanese American Student Relocation Council. And we want to help those interested to get to college or get back to college. But, as you know, it has to be someplace away from the West Coast.
Mr. Bodine went on that getting a college to accept someone was going to take letters of recommendation. If accepted, the government would have to clear that person to leave there. And the college would have to guarantee that person's safety in its community. Not that it all mattered. Really cold, below zero. The mud froze into
It's a fourth grade class here.
for miracles.
Service Committee, Education Council. But, as you know, it has to be someplace away from the West Coast.
Mr. Bodine went on that getting a college to accept someone was going to take letters of recommendation. If accepted, the government would have to clear that person to leave there, and the college would have to guarantee that person's safety in its community. Not that it all mattered to me. I wasn't old enough. I was pulling for Yuri.
Is it safe for us out there?
You will find that other places in America are not the same as what you might have experienced on the West Coast. Believe me, there are other Americans who see you as fellow Americans. Try it. Get out of here and see for yourselves.
By February, the U.S. Army came recruiting for volunteers from all the camps, including Minidoka. And a few weeks later, all 17 and older had to fill out an application for leave clearance. To get out of Minidoka, 2 questions determined our loyalty to America. One question was if we would serve in the U.S. military. Some of the fellows, like Harry, said that we had to prove our loyalty. Because we weren't seen as loyal, that's why we ended up there. Maybe doing so would get their families out of that camp. Others argued, how could we fight for a country that did that to us? The other question asked if we would renounce any loyalty to the Emperor of Japan. For most of us kids born in America, we had never had any connection to Japan or the Emperor, other than our parents were from there. How they answered 2 questions, labeled if they were loyal or disloyal to America.
We're going to block 22 to fill out the questionnaire. If answering yes to those 2 questions means I get to get out of here, you know how I answer.
Mr. Bodine started coming around to our quarters to help Yuri get into college. One time, he brought a friend.
Sumiko, this is Father Tibazar. Were you familiar with the Mary Noel School back in Seattle? He was the pastor there.
Oh, on 16th and Jefferson?
That's right. I've brought Father along to translate the more detailed aspects of Yuri's college application to your parents.
This man? Speaking Japanese? I had to hear this.
How we pay? And where she live?
The friends will set her up when she arrives. We can find the housing, provide a stipend, a part-time job. We'll also see if she can get a scholarship.
Sure enough, Father Tibasar translated for my folks, rattling off in fast Japanese just like someone from Japan.
You have a good batch of recommendations here, and those which attest to your American loyalty. Silly thing to have to do. Exactly. One from Arthur Kleinko. As the education superintendent here, that'll go a long way.
I'm really grateful for that, being that I couldn't handle a 2nd grade class.
Well, he sees something in you and knows the conditions you were under. Think about a college you'd like to go to. If you like, we can target Philadelphia area schools.
And we'll help you get a sponsor to get you over there.
At our school, we then had a real teacher, as our old folks and the folks in charge called them. Even a blackboard now, and donated textbooks from the turn of the century. Some weeks later and after school, what was Yuri so happy about? Like I hadn't seen in a long time.
Temple University! Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, here I come!
Harry had already left to join the U.S. Army in the Japanese-American 442nd Regimental Combat Team. He and Yuri agreed to meet up again after the war.
We'll be teachers somewhere in Seattle after this is over.
Well, hope everything turns out okay when you get back home. And Sumi, you be one high-tone basketball player, okay?
You got it.
Goodbye.
Of course, there weren't any goodbye hugs. Japanese didn't do that. I wanted to hug my sister and not let her go. But she got the chance to get out of there and be a part of America again. Who could blame her?
I'm author Ken Wood. No.
You're right here with us.
I was gonna say, who was that guy to him? Keith and I, we were just talking before this started that, I asked her, how much do you think, what percentage of the book is in this animation? And we agreed, maybe it's just about a sixth of the entire book. But, okay, so as Paul was talking, I guess Paul was involved in the hiring because, you know, in February of 2018, I got a call from Wayne Loop Museum saying that I was hired as the writer for their third graphic novel in a series on Japanese American history during World War II. And this one was to be on the non-Japanese who helped those of Japanese descent during World War II. And my first issue was, who would I include? And there are quite a few, well, not quite a few, there are a number of across the nation who have more known stories. And one of those is Colorado Governor Ralph Carr, who pretty much committed political suicide by defending those of Japanese descent in the state during the war. But I had to cut it off somewhere. I couldn't include everybody. So I thought I would choose those in the Seattle area, which would include Bainbridge Island. And so doing a book on this subject, these people had been talked about in the Japanese American community for a long time, going back decades, maybe to the early 90s. And some people had started doing their own research to do their own books or whatever documentation. And then when my baseball savers came out, well, I was the writer then, so they all turned over the research to me, saying, you know, you do it, kid. And so that and other research that I have from other books about the subject of Japanese Americans during World War II. And I have to emphasize, good thing there's Densho, which is the website that has virtually everything and anything about Japanese American experience during World War II. And among their collection were interviews, either with the real helpers, well, we were calling these people helpers, those who worked on the book. And and Densho had either interviews with the actual helpers or their family members or their descendants. So that was the research, but I tried to be as inclusive and to cast a wide net as I could in including these helpers, which included a Black African American, Daisy Tibbs, who became Daisy Tibbs Dawson, and also Felix Narte and the Filipino farm workers on Bainbridge Island who tended to the Japanese farms while they're away. and also to the farmers of the Alvin and Muckleshoot tribes who did the same thing. And a requirement for me was that any of these actions that I portrayed that the helpers were doing had to be based on an actual event actual event or action that they did. So that's why if you see in the book, there's these little numbers in the text, and they refer to the endnotes and citations at the end, which identifies the source where I got the story from. Okay, so then the next issue became, how do I do this? Well, you could do individual biographies, but there wasn't enough to go on. And plus, I wanted to show the effect that these helpers, what they did for the Japanese American and the community. And so I came up with this far-fetched idea maybe at the time. Well, what if I create a fictional character to encounter these real people? What if I did a Forrest Gump to meet these real people along the way? And so then I started pursuing that, and then but who would be this character? So I'll tell Paul, my community advisor, who comes with this story, that in the 90s, when I was being assigned for baseball save, there was a Sansei lady, which means third generation, like Paul said, me and him were part of that generation. She was older than me, well, at the time. And I signed the book for her, and I gave it back to her. And when she took it back, she said, write a book with a girl next time. And she didn't say this as a request. She said it as a command. And so, okay, but if I could find a good enough story, that would be a protagonist. Okay, so then also 2018, when I was started doing this book, it was the year of the Me Too movement. And so that also was further impetus to have a female character as my Forrest Gump. And then through this fictional character, it was like my vehicle to include all these other people along the way. I had her starting out as around 11 years old at David Gatzard Elementary. And so I could add in, you heard of Miss Mahan mentioned in the video. That was Ada Mahan, a legendary principal at David Gatzard Elementary, known for all her unique teaching methods. And I could have her going to Japanese Baptist Church so I can get Reverend Emory Andrews there. And also I wanted to get, he wasn't in the video, Gene Boyd, who was the legendary Seattle Parks Department athletic director and coach at the Collins Field Fieldhouse, which was used to be by the Buddhist church up there in the central area. And so I started pursuing this idea, and then if the Community Advisory Council wanted to tell me I was crazy, they could do something else then. But this character was further confirmed when, well, I spent about 4 months doing the research alone, so it was mid-June by this point, and I thought, I gotta start writing because the deadline for the first draft was October 1st. So I was parked in my car in the Queen Anne area waiting for another event to start. And I started writing with pen and paper. And then I was pretty close to Key Arena, now on the Village Arena. And I didn't know there was a Seattle Storm basketball game there that night. And so as I'm there sitting in my car, I start seeing these young girls walking past, and they're all wearing their Sue Bird jerseys. So then I thought, okay, Nisei girl around 11 years old, and she will be an aspiring point guard type into dribbling, ball handling. And so there the character went, and it was not easy writing this because all I had really to go on was I knew, you see the book, the final basketball game back in Seattle when Sumiko returns back home, it would end with that. And all else that I had to go on was the basic timeline that any of the generations who went through the camp experience, they usually divide their lives into before the camp, before the war, and after the war. So that was pretty much all the outline I had. So it was scene by scene by scene. I'd be working on one scene. I didn't know what was gonna come after the scene I was working on. But there was this popular famous author of historical novels named E.L. Doctorow. In the late 70s and early 80s, he wrote these historical novels like Ragtime, Billy Bathgate. And he said this great quote, and he said, sometimes writing is like driving that night in the fog. You can only see as far as your headlight beam, but yet you make the entire journey that way. And that's exactly what happened. And I didn't finally meet deadline. And also there were anonymous helpers also for Congo. Can you pop up the first image? There was, yes, that's it. There was, this is based on a story by another legendary Nisei named May Namba. And her story was that after the executive order came down, and then she was helping to process those members of her community at the Japanese American Citizens League headquarters here in Seattle with a bunch of other Nisei girls. And they had just had graduated from high school. May graduated from Garfield. But hanging around, hanging out with them while they do all the processing was a U.S. Army soldier. He was a driver for the lieutenant in charge there. And whenever he wasn't driving, he hung out with these girls. Maybe that's why he was hanging out there. And then May had said, he overheard May saying something like, well, I'm not going to be here in Seattle for my birthday. I'm going to be wherever they're going to take us. And she must have said the exact birth date, because when she was there being detained on the Seattle Fairgrounds, that same soldier appeared with a birthday cake, said, happy birthday, May. And he wasn't hitting on her or anything, because that's all he did. He walked away without saying anything else. And May never knew his name. So, yeah, so this was a recreation of that whole incident, except he's giving the cake to Yuri. Oh, by the way, I also named this character Yuri in honor of Yuri Kochiyama. And at the next to the final frame there, Yuri says to him, thank you so much, mister. I don't even know your name. And he just waves and walks off. So was he transformed into a helper somehow? Was it because he was witnessing what was going on? Or did he think that he was a participant in helping remove these people? We'll never know. Oh, and by the way, I forgot to mention that when working the Gene Boyd, the athletic director, and Frank Fuji, who was a renowned artist, art teacher, coach of Franklin basketball high school team, who brought his team to the state championship game. Then he was an instructor here also. And he said, if it wasn't for Gene Boyd, I would have been a juvenile delinquent back then. And this was back right after the war, when they returned to Seattle. And also, when we speak of the helpers, you saw Arthur Kleinkopf in this video. He was the supervisor of student teachers. Then he became the superintendent of education in the Minidoka camp. And it was a major, major find to have Arthur Kleinkopf's diary from when he was working there from fall of 1942 through spring of 1946. He was still there after the camp closed in October 1945. And in his diary, he listed in detail all his events, what he did that day, even down to what he was eating for every meal, which wasn't very good, he said, even for the staff there at the Minidoka camp. And so in his diary, he has this one story. Next image. Yeah. Dated October 16th, 1942. And in this passage, you're going to hear him calling the Japanese Americans evacuees. That was the government euphemism for the evacuation, call the whole process. And Twin Falls, because you saw it's the nearest big town. 3 Japanese ladies secured a pass to go to Twin Falls to buy Sunday school and nursery school supplies. It was necessary for someone of the appointed personnel staff to accompany them as driver of the car and also as sort of a chaperone. Though I see no need of a chaperone, I suppose the driver is necessary. I was chosen as the driver. 2 of the ladies are the only certified teachers on the evacuee teaching staff. None of the 3 had been outside the camp since their arrival early in the summer. They were thrilled beyond words by the sight of trees, flowers, and green fields. One lady said, "Mr. Kleinko, I'd just like to get out of the car, walk over to one of those trees, touch it, and put my arms around it." A lump came into my throat as I tried, somewhat unsuccessfully, I'm sure, to understand, because only those who have experienced the sufferings and longings of a minority group whose members have been evacuated from their homes and all that home holds dear can ever fully understand the feelings of that lady who wanted to caress the tree. And illustrations here on the right. This is my favorite of all Kiku's illustrations from the book, because it's all done in silhouette for one. But you have Arthur Conco in the foreground with his back to us, and you know the ladies. If that one didn't have her arms upraised, it wouldn't have the same effect. Because this really captured that momentary joy of just seeing a tree, which they haven't seen because out there it was all flat ground sagebrush. So I thought this one really encapsulated this passage out of Mr. Conoco's journal. And also, next image, please. Yeah. This scene takes place early in the book. This is like a little while after the attack on Pearl Harbor. And Sumiko, our main character, and Sister Giri, and then with Sumiko's with their main buddy and basketball buddy, Mary Kay Cohen. And then there was Mary Kay's older sister, Francine Cohen, who's also Yuri's basketball buddy. They're in downtown Seattle, and this incident happens. I love this illustration because the last frame, when Francine tells the lady off, it just explodes off the page. And it's also great because the lady's reaction is in the same frame. If it wasn't a separate frame afterwards, it wouldn't have the same effect, but being in the same frame like that. And while I was writing the book and came to the scene, I didn't think it was anything particularly significant at the time, except getting Francine's reaction in there. But with time, I see this as a representation of one of the main reasons why the whole forced removal and the incarceration happened was because most of America stayed silent. They did not protest in any unified way, did not oppose what was going on. Even the American Civil Liberties Union, which is supposed to protect American constitutional rights, they didn't do anything significant as a national organization to oppose this. Individual ACLU lawyers did, yes, but as a national organization, no. And then as I said before, the Supreme Court also upheld the executive order. But if there were some kind of unified voice or organized voice against what was going on, would US history have been different then? So the title of today's program is Those Who Helped Us, Solidarity Across Communities, Past, Present, and Future. Well, maybe that starts with, because they're my friends. That's why. So, and as Forrest Gump said, and that's all I have to say about that. And I'm going to turn it over to our illustrator, Hughes.
Thanks so much. Sorry. Working. Yeah, thanks so much. And I absolutely love this scene also specifically because, you know, these little moments of helping that are not necessarily, you know, people in positions of power, but are still doing what they can in their own capacity to stand up for their community members. I think that's a really inspiring thing. You know, back in 2017 was it when we first started this project? 2018, yeah. I think most of us remember sort of where we were emotionally in the years 2016 through 2020. And, you know, it continues. But, you know, I think part of the reason why I really wanted to sign up for or apply for this project was, you know, this feeling of sort of helplessness of not knowing where to start with, you know, trying to fix or close the, I don't know, fix everything that was wrong with the country. And I think what Ken really captured really well in this book is that even if you don't have the institutional power to change what is happening around you, these little moments of solidarity and of reaching out and of extending this sort of fellow humanity to other people can still have an impact. And I think the great thing about this book especially is that so many of these stories, like Ken said, are based on true things that he heard from community members who, you know, even when they didn't know exactly who was helping them, those moments stuck with them. And through generations, they sort of were passed down as these important stories in the community. And so it really shows the impact that these little moments of help had. And I think it's important also to acknowledge that, like Ken said, you know, we tried to include as diverse of a group of people that were helping Japanese Americans at that time. But a lot of the stories, of course, are lost or are just underreported on, I guess. So it's hard to dig up those stories, especially when people who were helping didn't have that kind of institutional power that we typically see when history is recorded. It's usually reported upon. Sorry, I'm messing up my sentences. History records people that have institutional power more often than people who don't. So, you know, this community memories of these little moments of help are really important to write down, even if we don't have a ton of information about them. I really appreciate being able to, you know, participate in a project like this. And so, you know, Ken has most of the information about the about the actual events and the people in this book. And I'm Yonsei, I'm fourth generation, and my grandmother was incarcerated in Topaz. They were from the San Francisco area. So my mom moved to Seattle from New York, where my grandmother eventually ended up after camp. So I didn't know a lot about the story of the Seattle Japanese American community and what they went through during World War II. I knew more about the San Francisco story, but even then, my grandmother died before I was born. So it was a lot of rediscovering this information as I got older. And it was really amazing to be able to read Ken's script and to see, you know, the uniquely Seattle stories that were presented in it. And to see how that is still remembered in the Seattle Japanese American community. It was really important learning process for me. And so, you know, in lieu of having a lot of factual historical information about this, I will say that it was amazing to have the opportunity to again tell this story in the format of a comic, because not only because, you know, I think it's an accessible medium, especially for younger readers to really get interested in the story. But something that I love to talk about is the work of Mine Okubo, who wrote a very foundational text, Citizen 13660, which was, I believe, the first book published by a Japanese American about their experience in incarceration after the incarceration camps closed. I believe it was published in 1946. And because of that, it was still censored by the WRA, the government authority that was in charge of the camps. And, but she published it, it was an illustrated diary, essentially, that she was publishing together as a collected work. And so it was essentially a comic in a lot of ways. It had text and it had illustration. And they didn't interplay in the exact same way as a comic, but in a lot of ways, it was a comic because the drawings give you information that the words do not, which is, I think, one of the baseline definitions of what makes a comic. And I think what's really inspiring to me about reading Citizen 13660 is the fact that despite the censorship of the WRA, in her text, she's got kind of a neutral language, but her drawings bring the emotion to the fore. And so she was able to tell the story in a much more emotionally detailed and authentic way by making it a comic. And in that way, I think, honoring her legacy and honoring the legacy of artists in camp, so many of whom, left these beautiful pieces that you can still use as primary source documents today, by making the story of the comic. It was very meaningful to me personally. So yeah, thanks so much for having us and for reading this book. Thank you to Ken for writing it so beautifully. It was such an honor to work and to know, fully that it was in good hands because Ken is such a, experienced and celebrated author, especially about Japanese American history. So.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Let's give them another round of applause. Yeah. Wait, are y'all up for a Q&A? Yeah, okay. Any questions?
What's the update since the mention of the American time?
What was the mission? What were they trying to achieve?
Yeah.
Oof.
Not the carbon.
Well, a presidentially appointed commission in 1980, appointed by President Carter, wanted to get to the reasons why this whole incident happened. And the reasons they came up with, and it was like the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, which was signed by President Reagan. So before you from Woodrow, whatever, it was signed by President Reagan. And then what their conclusion was, why this happened was race prejudice. That had been going on way before Pearl Harbor happened, Pearl Harbor churches, well, this happened. As we know, immigrants from Asia, they were tolerated as long as they provided the labor. But when they became economic competition to the rest of Americans, that's when they were disdained. And then you had, there was a presidential candidate, I forget, was that 96? That when she said there was never an American immigration law based on race, but which isn't true. There was the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which specifically, of course, is targeted towards the Chinese immigrants. Okay, so race prejudice, which was always there, and the other was war hysteria, which is a big part of it. Maybe that's why nobody, most Americans didn't speak up or oppose it, because the hysteria was what it was. And you saw in the video, like the price Reverend Andrews had to pay for the stand he was making. They won't dare, a lot of people won't dare go against popular opinion. And which leads to the third, failure of political leadership. That not only means that politicians didn't do or stand up to maybe would have something wrong, but most politicians, of course, they want to be elected and re-elected. And so they're going to go with the popular sentiment, opinion of the time. And a fourth, which I'm surprised they didn't include, which would be economic opportunism. They wanted, other people wanted what the Japanese had, the Japanese immigrants, the East, they had achieved the American dream by this point, like 1940, 1941. We had Japanese immigrant tycoons in some cities. They were rich, wealthy, they were doing very well. And I think the figure is something like Japanese dairy farm supplied 70% or more of the milk for the Seattle area. Pike Place Market, over 75% of the stalls were occupied by Japanese farmers. So economic opportunities, other people wanted what they wanted. The farmers, the only land they can get to farm was like filled with stumps. And they cleared those out, made a productive farmland or land on any power lines or something like that. Land that nobody else would buy, airports that nobody else wanted. They made it their real protected farmland. So that's pretty much why it happened.
Yeah, and I'll add, you know, I think that the wartime hysteria is definitely a lesser reason. And the reason I say that is because you look at a place like Hawaii, which is where Pearl Harbor happened. But the Japanese American community in Hawaii was so much of an economic power, like in the workforce, they were so much a big part of the workforce that they didn't force most Japanese Americans in Hawaii to go to camps, even though that is where Pearl Harbor happened. So it was definitely motivated chiefly by existing racist bias and economic opportunism. I agree.
Yeah, it was about 40% or so of the Hawaiian workforce was of Japanese descent. So if they removed all the islands Japanese, the economy would collapse. And even the Roosevelt administration finally agreed to that. Yeah.
Was the Japanese community in like when you were making the move there, like schools, like did they know work and then you know their experience and what are you able to add from their experience? How
Yeah, she said essentially how much cooperation were we getting from members of the global Japanese American community? A lot. Yes, we dedicated the book to Luis Kashino and Yoshi Nakagawa. And Luis Kashino, it's gold when you have somebody who actually went through that experience who could remember it all specifically. At when they're in their 90s or something like that.
And is willing to talk about it.
Yeah, well, yeah, exactly. Is willing to talk about it. And she was my go-to source about specific details about camp life, especially in Seattle. And it's in the book that there's like dysentery in the Seattle fairgrounds, and everybody's running to, there were just outhouses back then. There's like series of holes in the board. And there was like 6 in the outhouse. And then, so there was dysentery and everybody's making a run for these outhouses. And then the camp guards, they thought it was a prison break. And so they turned on all the lights, while the machine guns started pointing in to where the crowd was. But that was her story that she told. And, but again, a lot of those who actually went through the experience, they're no longer with us, or they weren't with us at the time we were trying to do this book. But good thing, like I said, we have dental, we have records, we have interviews done before they passed away. We're very fortunate in that respect. Yeah. Yeah, there was a suit in 46, or so right after the war, and there was limited success with that. They had more success with the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, where each of those who went through that experience, went through the camps, and were still alive on August 10th, 1988, when President Reagan signed that bill. They were granted $20,000 each and an apology from the president at that time. By the time they got around to actually distributing the redress money, George H.W. Bush was president.
Yeah, and my grandmother was dead before the redress movement, as I think a lot of Nisei died fairly young. at least in her community. So it was definitely a delayed response, but from what I've read, it seems like the apology was almost more important than the money, because it was really an acknowledgement of the government's wrongdoing and the sort of a lifting of almost the anxiety of talking about it. Because there was no longer the fear of retribution from the government, I guess.
Yeah, the immigrant generation that you say, they were wiped out by the camp experience. And a lot of them by that time, when they got out of the camp, they were like maybe in their 60s by then. They were too old to go back to what they used to do. Yes.
Oh, hi. Hey, as a writer also, I really love the doctoral quote that you shared about driving at night. I also drive at night in fog sometimes, so that happens. I'm curious, I find that an apt metaphor for writing. Is it also, do you find any relevance in that particular quote, like driving at night in the fog, like when working towards bringing social justice into the world, like working towards highlighting or illuminating past wrongs to bring understanding to the world? In other words, I guess, is working for social justice in some ways also like driving at night in the fog? I'm just curious of that.
Well, I'll say even for a children's book that I do, it would have to have some kind of message or meaning to it. Even if when people ask me, or would you do like a cute animal story? I would, but it would still have to have a social justice message to it. Otherwise, to me, it's like, why do it then?
Yeah, I think, oh, sorry. I think in terms of social justice, I would actually consider it more of I don't know. I think the reason that doesn't necessarily apply for social justice work, I think, is because it's necessary when you're looking to improve things in your current society to look behind you and to understand where you're coming from and the who has built the road that you're on, basically. So in that way, I think it's less of a foggy drive and more of I don't know, a mountain trail that somebody built that you are following. You don't know necessarily where it's going to end up, but you do know where you were.
Well, yeah,
Yeah.
the sign at the bottom said the top is there, this many miles. Yeah. Well, as Keith was saying, as the saying goes, how do we know where we're going unless we know where we've been?
There's a question coming from YouTube. That's where I'm piping in. Okay. So there's actually from Tracy Puritani over at North Seattle College. And they wanted to know, you talked a little bit about the support that people had when from the Muckleshoot and Puyallup and from other people, but they were wondering more, what was the reception like when people returned from the camps post-war? How helpful or not helpful were the communities? And they shared, Tracy shared that his uncle recalled living in a FEMA-style trailer for about a year by Hollywood Burbank Airport, and that was a pretty hostile return. So just wondered if you could shed a little light on that. Yeah,
well, that varied. Yeah, some returns to a very hostile environment. It happened in the Seattle area also, but then again, you had these helpers to bring the Japanese back, and Roy Schmoe and his American Friends Service Committee, they have what was called work parties, and yeah, it's in this book also, and then they would go around repairing the homes that the returning Japanese Americans were going to live in. They washed off and wiped off the graffiti, the anti-Japanese graffiti that were on the homes. So yeah, there's some came back, some really hostile reaction from the locals. Yeah, some homes were shot at, some were victims of arson. Yeah, very, but just a quick story here, like how these helpers kind of like paved the way. On Bainbridge Island, there's a legendary couple in the Woodwards, Walt and Mildred Woodward, and they had this amazing foresight, vision. Even just when the town was being taken away, because they had their former janitor in their newspaper shop to be a reporter, because they're being shipped to Amazon. And then he wanted him to like report just maybe on vital statistics, even like who died, who was born, who got married, which baseball team is winning, to make it appear to the islanders who's still there. It's like so you can keep up on what the former neighbors are doing. It's like they almost never left. And so sure enough, they were welcomed back. And because the people who were still there said, oh yeah, we know she was born and she passed away, and yeah, it's like he never left. And so you have people like that too, that really made it possible. But yeah, and then after they were released from camps, a lot of these people, they had nothing by that time. They even wanted to stay in camp, at least there they had food and a roof over their head. There was no guarantee of that when they left the camps. And in fact, in Minidoka, I think there was quite a few still left, a couple thousand or something, when the camp closed, that pretty much refused to leave. So yeah, they had to live in, a lot of them lived in trailers, or they came back to Seattle. They lived in the Japanese American churches. Lived there. And we have in the book also, and then the Japanese language school. That's there on 14th and Weller. Yeah, that was turned into like a hospital. They divided up the classrooms into like living quarters, like with a curtain dividing the room in two. And so those who were living there, they said, hey, it's just like camp all over again. Except they didn't have to go outside to use the latrine. This time it was right down the hall, still inside. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, completely, thank you.
Yes.
So I guess thinking back to that experience, how since then, the decade after returning to the camp, I guess how did the community evolve? How did they take that to power? How did they kind of become again kind of a passion for the community that's still generally kind of part of it?
Yeah, essentially, how did they recover? Yeah. After that experience, just about a lot of hard work. Pretty much. I mean, they started with nothing. A lot of them, and then just like a lot of hard work, but they were acting differently than before the war. I mean, if you just even look at photographs, look at the East Aid generation, the immigrant generation, they're all dressed up in their three-piece suits, gold chain across their vest. And the Poles, they have their thumbs in the vest pocket, and they all have their heads hooked up, just kind of even arrogant looking, and so forth. Then you look at them after the war, they're hiding. They don't even want their photo taken. So that's what the camp experience did to them. Because they kind of like it was ingrained in them. If they attract attention to themselves, we know what happens. They have a saying, the nail that sticks up the highest gets hit the hardest. So they would just try to remain, they just try to blend in. They don't want to stick out again. It's pretty much what happened. And so they were just trying to make it in America again. Yeah, they ran into a lot of prejudice and discrimination. Yeah, believe it. It's like where they can live, where they can work, and so forth. But it's because say their parents were from Japan. There's all those Japanese from Japan cultural traits, like gaman, you barely unbearable, no matter what. shikatakana, meaning that it can't be helped, so deal with it, pretty much. And then those were part of it too, but yeah, but as far as culturally, our mindset, there's this Dante writer, he's in Minneapolis named David Murrah, and he said that, he said, when you put a shoplifter in jail, what are you trying to teach that person? Not to shoplift anymore, right? When you put a Japanese person in prison just because it's Japanese, what are you trying to teach him? Not to be Japanese anymore. And then that's pretty much what happened. You look at the Nisei generation, they'll change their names to more Americanized sounding names and so forth. Yeah, it was just a whole matter of just trying to blend in and be American and not call attention to your Japanese ancestry anymore. Because anything Japanese really hated in this country for maybe at least till the 60s. And that all came back when you get in the 80s and then Japan becomes a big economic power in the world, and it all comes back. And it all came back again with COVID. It wasn't so much Japanese, it was if you're Asian, then you get blamed for it. So it's a matter of just trying to cope, but you know, we're part of America too. Always will be. And also, we have a long history in this country. My first grandfathers came here to this country in 1905 and 1907. That's over a century now. And a lot of the families, they've been in this country of all the Asian groups for a good century and a half, maybe since the late 1800s or so. So immigration from Asia is not a recent phenomenon. We are not all foreigners or immigrants. Okay, so don't blame us for COVID. Go protest at the Chinese consulate, even though I don't recommend that. We are not responsible for what happens on the other side of the world. Just like the Japanese Americans, they were not responsible for the Japanese military attacking Pearl Harbor or all the other atrocities. They would not came to the Bataan Death March. That was the Japanese military. More specifically, the Japanese military had their version of the SS called the Kempei Tai. They were the ones responsible for all the atrocities.
Yeah, I think one of the other after effects is, you know, you mentioned there are still Japanese farms, Japanese American run farms here. Certainly far fewer than there were before the war. And the dissolution of a lot of Japanese, Japan towns, little Tokyos and stuff like that. In Seattle, we had one called Nihonmachi, which basically obliterated after Pearl Harbor. And it's still sort of slowly starting to get recognized as a district again, but more of a historic district, not a reflection of who actually lives there. So I know, people in camp a lot of times were able to, if they had students or if they were students, like you saw, you was able to leave camp, but they had to go to schools on the East Coast or in the interior of the country. So a lot of people didn't return to the West Coast because it was an opportunity to leave camp a little bit earlier if you went east. And that led to, again, sort of the dissolution of the sense of real tight-knit community that is essential for a lot of immigrant groups to have that sort of base of community where you have your cultural centers, you have your food, you have your churches and your religious organizations. A lot of that sort of dissipated after the war. And like Ken said, this feeling of rejection of Japanese, things that are overtly Japanese. My grandmother did not teach her children Japanese, even though that was the primary language that their grandparents spoke, because it was frowned upon to be seen speaking Japanese in public. And so, that loss of culture was a big part of the after effect, I think.
Are the Chinese culture in Seattle recovered from that? Or are they affected this with compared to all the downfall that
You said that they're Chinese?
Also, sorry, chapter. As they were talking about the Americans, civilizations.
He says,
Better in Seattle area.
yeah, okay, he says that the Japanese American community essentially recovered from all the racism that they endured up to this time. Well, as Keith was saying, it has, but not in the same form. Before the war, you had MIT, right there, Chinatown International District on Main and Jackson, around that area. No, it'll be changed forever. As far as where people live, and then after the war, they started moving up this way towards the central area and Rainier Valley, Beacon Hill, if they could live there, if they were allowed to live in these places. And then nowadays, they're all on the east side, pretty much now, Bellevue. So, yeah, they have recovered in a different way. Pretty much, finally.
My question is related to once folks came back, along the West Coast, were there sentiments of anger or revolt towards the American system or the American culture that allowed this to happen? Because you were saying that there was more of a hiding and like a fear of being seen. Was there also anger or rejection of assimilating to American culture because of that?
Well, for the most part, not, or those who, the Nisei generation, let's say, who just came down, who went through the camp experience. Usually not, they didn't say anything, but because again, they're just trying to blend in and then wanting and antagonize them, drink it their way. But you know what's interesting is when you go to the bars where the Nisei, if they men hung out and they start drinking a little, yeah, and all that hostility would start pouring out. And then in fact, why you have the Nisei Veterans Committee in this city is because they couldn't join any other veterans group. They weren't allowed into Veterans of Foreign Wars or American Legion. So it just started out as a bunch of guys getting together drinking, which led to the Nisei Veterans Committee. Yeah, if there was any like anger or it remained hidden, or maybe some would just they stayed among their family members of close friends. But when it comes to like being out in general, no, usually not. I mean, yeah, you had some that were pretty vocal, and then they usually ended up in one of like Japanese American Citizens League or one of the civil rights groups. Yeah, it was pretty rare when we'd hear it all come pouring out. That was goddamn huggy.
And for the Issei especially, I think the first generation, one of the things that's important to also acknowledge is the fact that they were not allowed to have American citizenship until the mid-50s. 1952. And so there was not only a fear of retaliation from the government, but also, they were not allowed to have any protections of citizenry, which of their children who were born in America and were technically citizens were also not granted those rights fully. So I think there was a genuine and a realistic fear of protest in that way. But then you do have figures, Yuriko Chiyama, one of them. There are several others that are mentioned in the previous book in this series by Wing Luke called We Hereby Refuse by Frank Abe and Tomi Tanimura, that really discusses people who were actively protesting both during the incarceration and after. But yeah, I think because of the dissolution of community, I think that's a part of it. You need to have sort of a base of community support to be able to feel safe enough to protest things in a meaningful way. And I think part of what the government did successfully is break up those communities in the sort of scatter them across the country and make it harder to have that sense of community solidarity.
Yeah, that was even in writing, when they closed the camps, well, the War Relocation Authority was under the Department of Interior. And the Interior Secretary, Harold Ickes at the time, in his announcement that the camps were closing, that he said, well, yeah, this group was doubtlessly too concentrated in certain parts of the country. So, oh, is that the reason why it happened? It's some kind of like, almost like, what? Forced government-sponsored assimilation. Well, is that why it is? Because it's just down to economics again, right? You know, they were getting too economically powerful, the Japanese, in their little Tokyos, Japantown, yeah, break them all up. And then even the World Relocation Director said the camps happened because of those little Tokyos. He said in a speech. And just to show what the East Asia immigrants were up against as far as against or dealing with the government. Like he said, you cannot, the immigrants from Asia could not become American citizens until 1952. And then it was according to the state, but they had what's called alien land laws, meaning that you could not own land unless you were American citizens. So 2 strikes, right? I mean, they couldn't get sold. That's why when the order came down that they had to be removed, that they lost everything, because usually they did not own the land that they had their business or home on. So when the lease or rent was up, when they had to go, the lease or rent was up. And so that's why they lost everything. A lot of, there were those who were fortunate enough to have owned their own land, and to get around that, they would do something like put ownership in the name of their oldest American-born child, or they would form a corporation, and that way it'd be a little more obscure who really owns, this property. So yeah, they found ways, but for the most part, they lost everything.
All right, I think we are a little bit over time, so I'm gonna have to cut you all off, but thank you. No, please don't apologize. That was with me. Yeah, but thank you so much for sharing such a wealth of community history with us. I think it's especially frightening thinking about the breaking up of communities and like forced assimilation. It rings too close to home with our land acknowledgement. And I think recognizing those kinds of similar harms enacted by white supremacist systems and governments, I think that is where we can find our solidarity across communities. And I also want to acknowledge, speaking of community organizing, the Day of Remembrance Planning Committee. This committee has been led for 20 years by Paul Kurose and Tracy Furitani as a grassroots effort to have this event not only for the sake of saying that it was done, but because by centering the needs to grieve and remember and keep fighting of the descendants of the Japanese Americans that were incarcerated. That is the real meaning of this event. We organize this by thinking about how they're still impacted, how this loss of community, how the trauma that was done to their family members continues to this day, and we remember it and we say, never again. With that, I'd like to turn it over to our lovely co-sponsor, DeAndre, with the District Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, to just say a couple words.
I'm gonna just be real quick and just thank you, and gratitude and appreciation to be able to listen and to make sure that we never forget. You get it right there. We should never forget. So that's all I want to say, and just thank you. Honestly, and thank the committee for sure for all of the work and making sure that we do the work and actually make sure that we actually move the work forward. And that work is never forgetting and remembering that even in this building, the voices and the ancestors, the descendants will always be here. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, DeAndre. Your support means a lot to us. The committee members are all Japanese American. I'm not, I'm Chinese American. But I think like that one, like see if I can pull it back up. Yeah, because they're my friends, because they're my family. This is a community and we're all here together to support each other. Thank you so much. I'd like to like drop the mic and leave the stage with that, to make it more impactful, but a few more things. Paul and Tracy, who couldn't be here in person today, have brought in some of their materials and artifacts, documents, about the incarceration, including the original order posted around Seattle telling Japanese Americans to report to Puyallup, as well as some quotes and flyers commemorating things that activists and the community has done since then to remember this. So please feel free to come by and take a look. You can also head over to the lobby for some refreshments. And out there is also a list of the 216 students that were taken from Broadway High School and incarcerated. So please take a moment to look out the window, to think about this space and the people that have moved through this space and leave a candle for them. Thank you again.
There's also a Day of Remembrance event that's going to be happening at Puyallup tomorrow at 11 a.m. And part of that involves a journey then to the Northwest Detention Center, which is an immigrant detention center and a private prison that is open in Tacoma. And the Japanese American Citizens League, as well as La Resistencia, are going to be protesting outside the Northwest Detention Center at probably noon tomorrow. So show up.
11 a.m. at Puyallup.
Yeah, and also at 3 p.m. at Wingwood Museum in Seattle, there's going to be a program and book signing of all three of these books in this series on the Japanese American experience.
And 3 p.m. at Wingwood. If you drive really fast, you might be able to make it to both.
I hate the home button especially. I hit that thing so many times I'm going through the week.